Welcome to another edition of the Poetry Nook, a December, a kind of a holiday edition of sorts. I'm Charlie Hunt, as always, joined by my dear friend, Analía Gómez Vidal. How's it going, Annie?
It's going well. Wrapping up 2025. We made it.
Yes, and I mean, I feel like you and I are always in a reflective mood when we're joining to talk about poetry. But I think we've got a couple of poems and maybe a few scattered thoughts today about, how we end a year symbolically, practically, and how we think about what's next, and some of the maybe conflicting feelings we have around personal goals and thinking back and how we sort of move forward. And as always, I feel like poetry is our best tool to help us do that. Any thoughts, or you want to start us off with before kicking us off, maybe with your poem?
Yeah. So, what I like about this is, what our premise for today was finding poems that made us think about and reflect about our year, right? And in some ways, I think that it connects with a lot of the things that we have been discussing in our previous discussions about the ways in which poetry can inspire us and help us reflect. And at the same time, we talked about systems and structures. Like a lot of people might come across my work about like goals and strategies and a lot of like kind of like the hard-hitting words and buzzwords around what we want and how we get there. But I think this is also a very valid and lovely way of really reflecting on that in a way that has less to do with the specifics of the to-dos or the milestones and more about connecting with ourselves and how we're feeling as part of that process. And so I hope that this is also, an exercise that sparks some ideas for those listening to us to extend that possibility for themselves.
Yeah, certainly it'll be a helpful reminder to me. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about our goals and we get into this mode of trying to quantify and, okay, what percentage of my goals that I set out or resolutions that I made in the new year, what did I accomplish? And if I didn't do that, am I a failure? And we get thoughts like that creeping in. But I totally agree. It's also helpful to be thinking about this stuff in a more kind of fluid way. And to borrow a phrase, to sort of go off vibes a little bit more, maybe than than whether we ticked off all the boxes in the spreadsheet. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm excited to get into that with you.
And I will say too, also to extend grace and compassion to ourselves through that, right?
Yes.
I was thinking about the year, and one of the things that I realized as kind of like a funny side note is one of the things that I started this year is I took a drumming class. And so I started kind of like playing around with drum pads and just, seeing what comes out. But then I stopped for a long time because I had other stuff happening. And eventually the drum pads and the sticks like stood there for a while. And then when I moved them, I noticed like the new line because it had gotten worn out by the sun. So it was like such a visual reminder of like you had this thing here, but you haven't come back to it. And this is what it looks like now. And one could take it from that perspective of like, oh, I'm such a failure or whatever. And I think like to me in my mind as I'm thinking about this year, it's like, no, you know what? Yeah, it's been waiting. It might wait for a little bit longer. Maybe 2026 will be the year, but I don't need to be hard on myself.
And it creates a sort of interesting line, something else I know we've talked about before, which is sort of these external thoughts of like, what should, quote unquote, should I be doing? But those shoulds can maybe get us into a little bit of trouble and make us even lose touch with important parts of ourselves, and get us sort of farther away from our own internal compass, maybe of what feels right and what we want to do and what is sort of creatively driving us. So I've definitely felt exactly that way before. Um, Do you wanna start us off with a poem? I
Yes,
think we might as well get into it and sort of see where the words take us.
indeed. So, um, in thinking about 2025, for me, this year has been a lot about transformations and a lot about starting things that did not exist, but I wanted them to exist. I mentioned to Charlie off the record like that today is a very special day in that regard for my personal journey. And so I may or may not get emotional as I'm talking about this, but in looking for those poems about transformation and kind of like, crafting your own path, I came across this Puerto Rican poet called Julia de Burgos, whose work just like stood out to me in a way that I actually teared up the first time that I read this. And so I also want to share a shout out to my dear friend Adriana Martinez, who also Puerto Rican poet that you can find on Instagram at Boricua Reads. And she's the one who facilitated the most recent translation of the poem that I'm going to read. So I'm going to be reading it from the photo that she took of her book last night when I was like fangirling about Julia de Burgos with her. So I'm going to read first the version in Spanish, and then I will read the translation. So in Spanish, the poem is called Yo misma fui mi ruta. Yo misma fui mi ruta. Yo quise ser como los hombres quisieron que yo fuese. Un intento de vida, un juego al escondite con mi ser. Pero yo estaba hecha de presentes, y mis pies planos sobre la tierra promisora no resistían caminar hacia atrás, y seguían adelante, adelante, burlando las cenizas para alcanzar el beso de los senderos nuevos. A cada paso adelantado en mi ruta hacia el frente, rasgaba mis espaldas el aleteo desesperado de los troncos viejos. Pero la rama estaba desprendida para siempre, y a cada nuevo azote, la mirada mía se separaba más y más y más de los lejanos horizontes aprendidos, y mi rostro iba tomando la expresión que le venía de adentro, la expresión definida que asomaba un sentimiento de liberación íntima, un sentimiento que surgía del equilibrio sostenido entre mi vida y la verdad del beso de los senderos nuevos. Ya definido mi rumbo en el presente, me sentí brote de todos los suelos de la tierra, de los suelos sin historia, de los suelos sin porvenir, del suelo siempre suelo sin orillas, de todos los hombres y de todas las épocas. Y fui toda en mí, como fue en mí la vida. Yo quise ser como los hombres quisieron que yo fuese, un intento de vida, un juego al escondite con mi ser. Pero yo estaba hecha de presentes, cuando ya los heraldos me anunciaban en el regio desfile de los troncos viejos. Se me torció el deseo de seguir a los hombres, y el homenaje se quedó esperándome.
Even though I can't understand very much of it, it never gets old listening to you read poetry in Spanish. So thanks for that, Annie.
My pleasure. And so now I'm going to be reading the translation of it, which is translated by Vanessa Perez Rosario. And now the version in English is I am my own path. I am my own path. I wanted to be like men wanted me to be, an attempt at life, a game of hide and seek with my being. But I was forged of nows, and my feet firmly planted on the auspicious earth resisted doubling back. And they marched on, mocking the ashes to reach the kiss of new paths. With each step forward on my path towards the new, the dead tree's desperate thrashing tore at my back. But the branch was broken off forever, and with each new blow my gaze grew more and more and more distant from those well-known horizons. And on my face, an expression formed that sprang from within, an expression shaped by a nascent feeling of intimate freedom, a feeling surging from a sustained balance between my life and the true kiss of new paths. My path already defined in the now. I felt myself a seedling of all the lands on earth, of a land without history, of a land without a future, from the earth, eternal, boundless, earth of all men of all ages. And I was all in me as life was in me. I wanted to be like men wanted me to be. An attempt at life, a game of hide and seek with my being. But I was forged of nows, as the heralds announced me at the regal procession of all trees. The desire to follow men warped inside me, and the homage was left to wait for me in the wind.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to Julia de Burgos, because
Yes.
so there is a lot that can be said about her poetry, and I have not done yet the deep dive that I look forward to do with her work. But it spoke to me in a couple different ways. The first one is, as I mentioned, 2025 has been a year for me of creating things that didn't exist before, they existed in my mind. And what has been interesting is like I had been preparing for this year, for this work for many years. But there is nothing that can prepare you for doing the work. And so in the doing of this year, there was a lot of undoing and a lot of learning and unlearning who I am and who I can be, and also shedding a lot of the expectations that had shaped everything that I have done so far. And so this poem spoke to me in that way, right? Of the needing to be so deeply present with myself and recognizing the life in me so that I could keep going when it got really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that every line you read here, it was sort of creating lots of like bursts of color in my head
Mm-hmm.
of how to think about this challenge that I think all of us face at different points in our lives in different ways of trying to find our own path, trying to forge a way ahead when we don't know what's next, trying to deal with things like you said, even if we've known that they have been coming, or if it's a challenge that's on the horizon. It can still be difficult to address or confusing to address when you get there. There are so many different things about this poem that I want to touch on with you. You know, on one level, you have, I think, a common theme in poetry and literature and these other things, which is, and music, I think, for that matter, which is what I think my path is for me versus what others see as the path for me,
Mm-hmm.
or what other circumstances of my life, wanting to be like men wanted me to be,
Mm-hmm.
as the poet puts it here. Um, an attempt at life versus an actual rich, full life. And that these expectations, outside expectations, can make it difficult to find your being in a game of hide and seek, as she puts it. And um, that's sort of the first level of this poem that I think really spoke to me as you were reading it. How do you sort of think about that question of sort of outside expectations and outside restrictions versus, this kind of mysterious, organic pathway making that just springs up out of your own being?
One thing that I want to point out about it is that, like while I'm making it very personal to me, this poem, like the Julia de Burgos is a poet who does a lot of work around gender, and so like the who the men wanted me to be is very literal too, right? It's
Right.
like,
This isn't her saying how like humanity was, but men, right?
yes,
Wanting
like
her to be. Yes.
what's a woman's place, right?
Yes. Yes.
And there is a whole dimension of that we could talk about on personal experiences as well. Um, but I think that to your point, the more we find ourselves in that process where we shape our lives by what others are telling us that is desirable, is, worthy of praise and all of this stuff, the harder it becomes also to listen to that inner being,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And the heavier it feels to switch gears. And I think that, this is something that I often mention when I am talking, especially with graduate students as well. It's like there is a grief that goes into every change and transition that we go to. And like for me personally, that I continue to do research kind of like on the sidelines. But there is an inner struggle of, like the more my life and my career changes and the more I am able to create spaces for others to explore their own careers, there is also that element of who am I? And who can I continue being, right? And the grief of like, oh, I'm no longer a researcher the way that I used to be,
Hmm.
or others do not see me as the researcher that I used to be for obvious reasons. And so there is also that game that happens internally and externally of how do you listen to that voice when you are going through that process. And it's an interesting one.
It's such a difficult one, especially when, and I feel like one thing you and I have in common, over the past year, a couple of years, is that we've, made, I mean, to use the terminology of the poem, attempts at life of sort of exploring new things and new creative challenges and new, career opportunities or challenges. And that we can have sort of a one-dimensional way of thinking about that as, oh, just listening to your heart, following your own path, and these kind of platitudes that I think, that we see on posters or on LinkedIn or something like that, of like, just follow your path and everything will be fine. But of course, but I feel like this poem and what you were just saying really eloquently is just a really healthy reminder that it's not always that simple, that is an important thing to do. It is important to, I think, for a rich life to, um, be able to get in touch with whatever that inner compass is, or directionality that you develop, but that takes time. It takes work. It takes making space for yourself. It takes silence, something we've talked about before. And when you have lots of other expectations being sort of set upon you by others, or by society, or by another gender, or by a boss or someone like that, um, even if they're not malicious expectations, sometimes they're not, right? It's, if someone sees you as a researcher, but now you are taking on this other thing, like it's not necessarily malicious, but it can feel oppressive in how it sort of shapes how you, find your new paths. And I think it's especially hard because, especially as one is trying to follow these natural impulses, or, finding what's in your heart, or what creatively is driving you, what's going to give you the richest life that's coming from me. It's very vulnerable. I think one of the phrase I think I like most in this poem is the kiss of the new paths.
Hmm.
I think it's a beautiful phrase. It's incredibly intimate and
Hmm.
physical, and it's ambiguous in certain ways. A kiss can be a hello kiss, or a goodbye kiss,
Hmm. Or a kiss of
or
death.
the kiss of death, the first kiss, the last kiss. But no matter what it is personal. It is close to your heart, to your being, and it's kind of it's electrifying in both good and bad ways, as I think you and I have both found in sort of following some, new and exciting pursuits. It comes with great opportunity, it comes with challenges, but it makes it it makes the highs highs and the lows low because of how close it is to our hearts, because it feels like a kiss. And that's what I really liked about how she put that.
Yeah. And, I was actually having this conversation yesterday with my parents because a year ago today, I was getting the visa that would allow for me to launch my business. And they were not happy with me quitting my previous job to launching, right? And so yesterday we were talking about how sometimes I can be very much just kind of like so determined to the point of just like I am completely absorbed into this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said to them, like, I have to. I have to because a lot, uh, what people see out there is only 1% of everything that has been going on in the background, right? And and you have to have a certain mindset to really bet all into something that you're creating in in the darkness of your own room by yourself in the hopes that it's of service to others, right? And so that's where, to me, like the kiss of the new paths felt like such a loving way of describing that state where you embrace what is possible and all that hope, and at the same time that you either have nobody else witnessing all of it for you except for yourself, and or you don't necessarily yet have the praise or validation because we are used to kind of like seeing the bigger things, right? Like once it made it, but from the moment it starts to the moment it made it, there is like such a long journey.
Yes. And it's not always clear what making it looks like.
Exactly.
It's not, we don't always have, to our earlier conversation, we don't always have a clear metric of what success looks like, or what the fully realized version of a creative project or a relationship, or whatever project it is that is sort of getting at your heart at that moment, what that actually looks like in its quote unquote finished form. And of course, a lot of times, I'm sure this is the case with you, in your business and things like that. But, it starts off as an idea or some kernel of an idea. And of course, by the time it launches or becomes public or, reaches its finished form, even that beautiful idea has, of course, changed so much in that
Mm-hmm.
time and become something completely different. And then we become something completely different. And that makes it even harder, I think, to assess it, if assessing it is even a useful thing to do. But it's part of what I think, that all of that stuff just makes it even more vulnerable to go out and do things like that, because you not only do you not, you're trying to get a handle on what it looks like. DeBoer just talks about the nows, all of these
Mm-hmm.
nows
Yes.
that we are encountering new every day. Like something that looks way in the future is eventually a now,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have to be with it exactly as it is.
And that verse of like, as I and I was all in me as life was in me, was
Hmm.
particularly excited. Like it just like pulled me in so much because like there is so much of the life that we all carry in us that sometimes doesn't fully see the light out of fear or out of like other constraints. And so, like when thinking about this year and thinking about kind of like how I want to remember it and reflect on it, I think in my mind, going back to, extending grace and compassion, in my mind, it was very much about like honoring the life in me that I was able to put forth in some other ways.
I'm so glad that you have been pursuing that, because it's been, as your friend, it's been a joy to watch and to get to experience little parts of that. And I think sort of to a couple of the points that we've been talking about, as always happens when we talk, Annie, I'm seeing like connections already with the poem I already chose. And so, do you mind if I read one for us and we
Go for it.
take it from there?
Yes.
Okay. Um, I'm going to read a poem by one of my favorite sort of public poetic intellectuals out there, that our listeners might know, whose name is Pádraig Ó Tuama. He is an Irish poet and philosopher. He's the host of the amazing Poetry Unbound podcast from On Being Studios. I've been listening to him for years, and he has a number of really amazing books that contain a lot of his own poetry. And the poem I'm going to read today is from his excellent book called In the Shelter. And the poem is called Is It Working? When you've been alive for only 5,829 days, the pathways are rarely clear. Here, where the roads keep changing. What makes sense on one day makes no sense the next. And so, to avoid exhaustion and to deepen rest, ask yourself these questions. How would you describe today? And have you seen anything interesting on the way? And is it working? Is it working? Always, is it working? This this poem, I think, I mean, it struck me at the time. I first read it probably a few years ago when I read In the Shelter, which is an excellent, highly recommended book about sort of self-discovery and faith and poetry and all of these excellent things that I love talking about. But this is, I was already planning to read this poem, and then I was thinking about these questions that Ó Tuama sort of poses here as kind of alternatives to this very methodical kind of metrics-based way of looking back on our year, or of looking back on quote unquote progress that we've made, or whether we've done what we said we were going to do. I like that a couple of the questions that he poses, especially that last one that he repeats, are very present based. How would you describe today? That doesn't sound like a question you would ask yourself to sort of be like, well, how has this all been going? What's my progress? What's my status look like? It's just, how would you describe today? What's going on right now? And then this sort of very presence-based question of, is it working? And that can mean a million different things. You can define that however you want, whatever sort of feels right to you, whatever working means. And I think there are a lot of ways to answer that question, either in the affirmative or in the negative, without having like a good political scientist, like mountains of data to back it up. And so that's part of why I really like this is a lot of people have things they say to themselves or mantras or things like that to ground them. But I really love this very sort of malleable general question of, is it working? Is this working? And it's a way of sort of getting into conversation with yourself, your authentic self, about what it is your work or a relationship. Certainly you could imagine posing that question about. And so I love the question, and I love his way of framing it in this poem.
Yeah. And what I really liked about it, that I can see the connection, right? Because in some ways we were just talking about the nows in the Julia de Burgos poem. And here is this other poem that through the questions brings you to the now consistently. Is it working? Mm-hmm. Like when you have been around for so long, sometimes you just have today. So like, how would you describe today? And is it working? Like, are you, how is this connecting with the life in you? And so like, I really love that sense of, I think that there is a quality of presence that we have been seeing in like a lot of the poems that we have been discussing over time, that I think like these two kind of like pair up really nicely in that way.
Well, and I think too, the way he poses it in this poem gets to, I think, something really important that I try to remind myself of all the time. That when we think about goals and expectations we have for ourselves, or that other people put on us, or society puts on us, and when we think about things like, New Year's resolutions, resolutions maybe that we made foolishly back in January, not knowing what would be ahead of us. You can imagine a version of this poem that's asking things in the past tense, like, how would you describe your year that you just had? Did this work? Did that work? Did this strategy work? And in a way, his way of making it present, I think, is important for the reasons we just talked about. But I also think it's important because it's a recognition of the fact that the work isn't done. The
Mm-hmm.
life, the pathways that we talked about with the poem you chose. These pathways don't, they rarely have just like a clean end. They don't just end on December 31st of every year. Even if it's something like, you mentioned the drums. That's a very specific activity. It's a specific kind of, hobby or activity to take up. But it's not just that, right? I mean, I think you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like deciding to take that up or deciding to explore that is an image, a manifestation of some deeper purpose, some deeper desire towards creativity or learning, or the joy of learning something new, or these things that we try to cultivate throughout our lives that aren't just limited to one year. And so therefore, if we have questions like these of, is it working? How would you describe your day today? Like, these are questions we can ask ourselves every day to try to get a little bit of perspective that these are all continuous. These are all pathways that we are continuing, and they're changing, but that we're continuing on into 2026, into 2027, into 2048, right? And that can be daunting, but I think it's important to recognize, and it's one thing I really like about this poem.
Yeah. The whole concept of, like the holidays and particularly like New Year's and New Year's resolutions is like very artificial, right? Because like it's not a real stop and then like, okay, blank
Yeah.
slate, keeping moving.
It's
And
the
something that,
Gregorian calendar, right? We didn't invent it. It was just thrust
yeah,
upon us.
and it's not even the only New Year that we have throughout the
No,
year, if
yeah.
we're being honest. So,
Yeah.
but I think that one element of that I had been talking a lot about in the past few weeks has been it does feel like we are like rushing through to slow down in this
Hmm.
season so that then we can
Yeah.
like go into the new year. And when we do that, we often run the risk of kind of like losing touch with what we have been doing all along, what we have been able to create or learn or grown into. And, like there was part of like that thought process behind like picking the theme for today, right? It's like let's make a space for that intentional reflection and not feeling like we're kind of like discarding years, right? And just like accumulating them in
Right.
some ways.
Right.
That I think that going back to what we were discussing about whose expectations or what others want us versus like what we want, those questions in this poem are such a beautiful opening to also start unpacking that, because sometimes we may not even be ready emotionally to accept what is ours and what is not, and starting to ask those questions allow for that practice that then over time creates space for more honesty with yourself.
Plus, we want to, like, what I really liked about the poem you read is that it was really getting to asking tough questions about self inspiration or reflection, or pulling from yourself even when it's hard, what your genuine pathway or inspiration is that authentically comes from you. But of course, we also want to leave ourselves open to being inspired by others, and being motivated by, learning new things, or seeing what other people are doing and saying, that's really beautiful. Like, maybe that's something. Maybe that's the answer to the question of, what did you find interesting today? Or like, what did you, and, maybe it was something a friend did or a colleague did that sparked something, wherever the source is of this inspiration or this creative energy or whatever it is, that we're being open to it and we're taking it as it is, and we're sort of, preparing ourselves to, let it move us in whatever way it's supposed to move us. Particularly this time of year, it's like, okay, this slowing down and reflection, and then the implication is so that we can prepare to like hit the ground running on January 1st. Which, great, go ahead and hit the ground running if you would like to. But remembering also that, as we've talked about before, as you and I are talking about all the time, that the slowing down and the reflecting, it also has deep value and worth in and of itself, even regardless of what time of year it is or whether the new year's coming or resolutions or whatever else. So I feel like both of those things are important, difficult, but important to keep in balance, around this time.
Yeah, especially, a word that I hear a lot in my business is productivity, and kind of like how people, like we've kind of like moved into that space of like, well, rest is also productive. True. But, at the end of the day, I think like something that came to mind as you were saying this last part is there is a gift in authentic living. So, just like if we remove ourselves from like the productivity conversation altogether, you giving yourself the space to reflect and to connect with yourself and get to know yourself is the gift, regardless.
As we begin to wind down, do you mind if I take a bonus, a really short poem, an
Go
extra
for
one that
it.
I found for today? Okay. I think it'll sort of wind up our conversation nicely and get to a couple of tie-in, as always, with a couple of things we've already talked about. So this is a poem by Jane Hirschfield, and it's called "I Imagine Myself in Time." I imagine myself in time, looking back on myself, this morning, drinking her coffee on the first day of a new year, and once again, almost unable to move her pen through the iron air. Perplexed by my life, as Midas was in his world of sudden metal. Surprised that it was not as he'd expected what he had asked. And that other self, who watches me from the distance of decades, what will she say? Will she look at me with hatred or with compassion? I whose choices made her what she will be. And we've been talking a lot in this conversation about nows, about presence, about time, and this is, I think, an interest. And when we often talk about things like New Year's resolutions, they are, resolutions about who we want to be in the future or who we want to be this year. I mean, usually it's a little more than like a reflection of something we didn't like about ourselves, about last year. Like, oh, I ate like garbage last year, so I'm going to start eating salads, or like, I'm going to hit the gym on day one, And I really like this poem. It's sort of like a New Year's poem, but it's from the other perspective. It's her looking back on herself. She says from the distance of decades, which is sort of wild, that, thinking back and hopefully trying to have some compassion for herself. This person she's looking back on who, I think we can see as struggling creatively, perhaps, as we all do from time to time,
That
perplexed
iron
by her
air
life.
tells you
That
everything.
that one really spoke to me as a frequent possessor of writer's block. But I really love this very honest look back at herself, sort of thinking about herself as if she's herself in the past, as if she's a different person. And I just thought it fit nicely with the way we've been talking about, how we think about pathways and how the manipulation of time can really change our perspective on, how we think about whether we were successful or whether it's working, or whatever question we want to ask about it.
And there is an element that I think we're not always aware of. Going back to what you were saying about, the New Year's resolutions, for example, I think that sometimes we tend to not ask the harder question. Sometimes we tend to make the list of the goals and the resolutions based on what, comes to our minds, whether that is, like exercising or like traveling or whatever you add into your New Year's resolution. And I think that in some ways, what we are reflecting on today also opens the space for the harder conversation that is, who do you want to be at this point in time? Because in some ways, this poem is also inviting you to think about the ways in which your present self is going to make your future self proud.
Which can be a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, we're always sort of thinking back on, I mean, well, I'll just speak for myself. I'm constantly ruminating on poor decisions I've made in the past. I'm constantly thinking about, gosh, well, what if I had made this decision sooner or done this or like decided to pursue this? These are important questions, but they also can be unhelpful. I do think it's important to have compassion for your past self, but I think in some ways, like one thing I love, I like that this poem sort of touched into for me is that like thinking about having this vision of our future self, and usually it's an idealized version. Like like on January 1st, we're thinking like, okay, Charlie on, in 364 days, he'll have gone to the gym 3 times a week every week, and he'll be able to bench some amount of weight. I don't know what people bench, but like in a way, this sort of future thinking and this past thinking of sort of judging our past selves can rob us of thinking about the now, of just asking the basic present question of, is this working? Or whatever version of that question you want to ask. And that may be sometimes the best way to create or cultivate some future version of yourself that you feel like you can be proud of, or that your past self can be proud of. That the way to do that is maybe to let go of what the expectation is of a year from now or 10 years from now, and to just think, well, who am I right now? What can I do today? What can I do in the next hour that is going to make me feel fulfilled, or sort of capture whatever that sort of authentic essence is that we heard about a lot in the first poem. We are conditioned. Evolution has conditioned us to think about the past and try to learn from the past, and it conditions us to think about the future and plan and try to account for every potential thing that could go wrong. But it's always this struggle of staying in the present that I think is that, there's no one answer, but I appreciate that a lot of that. I think all the poems we've talked about today have touched on that from a couple of different angles.
I will say I have a slightly different perspective, but I think we land on the same spot, though. My mind has always been kind of like thinking about the future more so than the past, or kind of like, using a little bit of like the lessons of the past, but always with my eye on future. And that has also been a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? And it has taken me a lot of work to start kind of like bringing myself more into that present. That said, I think that the reason why I say that we might land on the same spot is because one of the ways in which I have, I guess, negotiated with myself, like extending grace and compassion to the past versions of me, is the fact that being able to understand that you have no control over anything but yourself and how you react to things is a very difficult exercise. And at the same time, it makes it easier to accept that the future version of you that you are idealizing and envisioning is likely not going to be exactly like that, but that the metric of success for looking back at the present is connected to that very much, like the very alignment of, is it working? And so in some ways, like, when I look back at past versions of me, the question that I'm asking is, was it working back then? Was I being as truthful and honest as I could be with myself at the time that I needed it? And did I make decisions that have made me proud since? And, when we think about resolutions and goals and years go by and all of this stuff, I think the question is less about what actual goal you want to achieve and more so who do you want to become by achieving it, which is actually a very famous quote that is attributed to Goethe. And I actually have it right in front of me all the time in my desk because it has always really impacted me a lot. It's like it's less about what you achieve and it's more about who you become when you achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. I really love that, and I think it has a really tight connection with the poem that you read, where by centering all the attention on, X number of days I've gone to the gym, or X number of pounds I lose, or X number of whatever, like it's kind of alienating the goal from the person, and that thinking about whatever a future version might look like. Or what I like about the Hirschfield poem is she's thinking about not just like what future Jane looks like, but how future Jane thinks about current Jane. And that it's drawing the two of them into relationship and bringing them together, as opposed to alienating them from each other and thinking about it as if it's a different person. And I think that gets to this idea of like, as long as we are thinking about this as a continuous journey, a journey of presence that is, of course, going to still be happening in the future and has happened in the past, but that there are ways we can think about it that make it personal and get to that very internal, intimate kind of kiss of the paths that is connecting us all the way through, and that isn't just this sort of obscure goal that's just out there in the wind. It's something that's really close to us, and I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about it. So thanks for helping me make that connection, and all the connections you always help me make.
And with that connection and all of this reflection, hopefully we're also helping anyone listening spark some more ideas and also extend grace and compassion through this holiday season that is joyful and restful, hopefully, but it also stirs up a lot of emotions about ourselves, about our lives, about where we're at. And so hopefully this is a conversation that soothes some of that.
Yes. God knows I'm sure we'll be stirring up some more feelings in 2026. So at the very least, Annie, I'll see you in January. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. See you next year to continue going in our Nook.